Holy God of love, wisdom, and grace, take my words and speak through them. Take our thoughts and think through them. Bless us with listening hearts that are on fire for your word and for your world. Amen. Have you ever heard the term humble brag before? If not, it's okay. It's actually a relatively new term. It's only been around for about a decade or so. I was wondering where it came from, so like most things when I don't know, I Google. And it turns out it came from a TV show called Parks and Recreation. But this term humble brag has really become a part of our society, a language that has been entered into the society. And what it means is it's when someone makes a statement that on the surface seems modest and seems very humble. But the actual purpose of the statement is to draw attention to something somebody wants to brag about, right? And I'm sure we've all heard a humble brag before, even if we haven't had the language to call it that. And if you've never heard of a humble brag, just go on social media. They're all over the place, right? In fact, again, I Googled, because I was interested, what are the top humble brags on social media? So I took the top 3 for you guys, for your enjoyment. There's the first one. I just ruined my perfect grade by getting a 96% on my quiz, followed by 3 cryy-faced emojis. I'm having headaches. It's been 2 whole days and I can't decide whether I want to accept my full scholarship to Harvard or MIT. This is my very favorite. I just did something very selfless, but more importantly, it was genuine. And I know it means a lot to the person in the long run. Hashtag so worth it. No matter the content of the statement, the humble brag is always annoying. And in many instances, the person making the humble brag does so at the expense of another person. While the term may be new, the humble brag as an action is not new. In today's gospel lesson, Jesus tells us a parable about pride and about humility. In this parable, we're told about a Pharisee and a tax collector, both who come to the temple to pray. But at the heart of this prayer for the Pharisee is a humble brag. And while the tax collector is praying with humility. The Pharisee says, I love this. God, I thank you that I'm not like everybody else. Those crooks, those evildoers and adulterers, even like that tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of everything I receive. He's got this humble brag thing down to a fine art. In the eyes of the public, this Pharisee is probably a pretty righteous guy. He does follow the commandments. He fasts, he gives money to the temple, gives money to the poor, he prays, he's a regular attendee at worship. According to society, this person is everything that a good churchgoer should be. So when he says, I'm not like these other people, like the crooks and the evildoers and the tax collector, he's right. He's not like those people. But where he's wrong is that in his pride and in his arrogance, he considers himself to be above all those people in the eyes of God. That somehow he's more valuable. That he's more worthy of God's love and God's grace than those people. In fact, this Pharisee really doesn't even need to be justified by God, does he? Because he's really already done all the hard work of justifying himself before God. Notice the wording Jesus uses here. The Pharisee stood and prayed about himself. The Pharisee may be addressing God in his prayer, but he certainly is not praying to God in his prayer. His prayer was a facade, right? It was a public statement of pride, masked in the humility of public worship and prayer. In other words, it's a humble brag. In stark contrast to this Pharisee, we're told that this tax collector is at the temple as well. Now, tax collectors are hated by everybody. Nobody likes the tax collectors. They're collaborators with the enemy, the Romans, and they actually make their living collecting more money than Roman taxes demanded. So this hated, despicable tax collector comes to the temple. But his prayer is a lot different than this religious elite Pharisee. While this Pharisee stands in the front of the temple and prays aloud for everybody to see him and hear him and how glorious he is, the tax collector sits at a distance, not with the rest of the congregation. He doesn't want to be seen. He keeps to himself. In the ancient world, people didn't pray like this. People prayed with their arms stretched and they looked up to the sky. Oftentimes they would pray aloud, but this tax collector, he doesn't look to the sky, does he? He doesn't think he's worthy enough to even look toward God in the heavens. He looks to the ground, and he laments all the ways that he has harmed his neighbor through his work, and he asks for forgiveness. And which prayer do you think was acceptable to God? Jesus says, I tell you, this person went down from his home justified rather than the Pharisee. See, the parable is not just about humility and pride. It's a reminder we can't earn God's grace. We're actually totally dependent upon God for salvation. But we can humbly come before God with humble hearts in prayer and give thanks. The problem with the Pharisee is that he thinks he's perfect. But just like everybody else, he's not perfect. He's failed just like we all have. In his pride, he has confused what he's done. That is, his good works, the good deeds he's done throughout the week, as being adequate to justify him before God. And in feeling so self-righteous, he also feels entitled to put himself above his neighbor. That the sinful tax collector is the one that's justified before God in Jesus' parable would have been the twist, right? That would have caused all those good church-going Pharisees to gasp in revulsion. They wouldn't think that tax collector deserves God's grace. They certainly wouldn't think that tax collector deserves as much grace as the good church-going Pharisee. Famous theologian Richard Rohr once said, "It is not addition that makes one holy, but subtraction. Stripping the illusions, letting go of pretense, exposing the false self, breaking open the heart and the understanding, not taking yourself too seriously." It was an illusion that the Pharisee is righteous enough to be justified before God on his own good works. And it was an illusion that he was more righteous than his neighbor, even more righteous than that tax collector sitting in the back of church. Today's lesson, Jesus is cautioning us to not be prideful in our good works, and especially to not let our pride be at the expense of our neighbor. There's no place for the humble brag when coming before God, because God sees through all of our self-righteous illusions for who we really are. Jesus tells us to humble ourselves before God's grace and before God's love. And in receiving all these blessings from God, we are then inspired to do all of these works that the Pharisee was boasting about. But we're not inspired to do these works for our neighbor out of pride. We're inspired to do it out of humble service for what God has done for us, for the blessings that God pours on us. In Ephesians 2:8, the Apostle Paul tells us, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your doing, but it is a gift from God." We participate in humble service to all people because of what God has done for us, not because of what we do for God. In the presence of the gift of God's grace and love, we are humbled to share that same love and grace because we didn't deserve it in the first place. God gave it to us anyway. No strings attached. And God's gift of love and grace is a promise to all people, a promise that we can always rely on. But today's lesson is not just about praying with humility. It's about treating our neighbor with love and humility. The biggest issue with the Pharisee's prayer really isn't even his pride. It's that he let his pride put him in a position to judge his neighbor. The Pharisee had put himself in this position of judgment, and he had judged that all these other people were not nearly as worthy, not nearly as good as he was. The Pharisee may have been a virtuous person, and he may have followed the letter of religious doctrine. But he failed to love his neighbor as much as he loved himself. He could have gotten the 10 Commandments right. He could have gone to church every week. He could have tithed. He could have done all those things he was boasting about, but he has failed. He didn't get it right. The Pharisee was showboating in front of the temple, praying aloud how great he was, and consequently how horrible these other people are. In the parable, the Pharisee actually names the tax collector sitting in the pews as one of the people he's glad he's not like. Could you imagine being the tax collector in that moment? Could you imagine coming to church with a burden that's so heavy on your heart you can't even look up? You can't even sit with the rest of the congregation. All the while the minister is pointing at you and naming you as what sin looks like. Boy, I don't know about you, but I'd be humiliated. I certainly wouldn't feel loved and forgiven by God's people and God's church. The Pharisee's self-righteous attitude would have driven a normal person out of the temple. And it's this other man, this tax collector, who's in need to feel the love and grace of a faith community probably more than anybody else. This was a missed opportunity for the Pharisee. If this Pharisee truly had a heart for God, he would have been reaching out to this tax collector with compassion. He would have sought ways to be of service to this tax collector, to show him God's love and God's grace. Instead, the Pharisee uses the temple and prayer as an opportunity to glorify himself publicly. It's interesting here that Jesus is not making a point on how terrible this tax collector is. He's not making a point that this horrible, evil tax collector really needed to repent and be more like this good church-going Pharisee. Instead, he makes a point about the Pharisee, the churchgoer, the one who never misses a worship service. What Jesus is getting at here is these opportunities that, as people of God, we miss when we decide to sit in judgment of other people. The missed opportunities to show our gratitude for all the grace and all the love that God has given us. I think it's interesting that both men come to the same temple at the same time to pray to the same God. One's this religious elitist who by society's standards is a righteous guy. The other's a despised tax collector who would have been considered a traitor by most of his own people. But Jesus says this tax collector who got it right. It's the tax collector that went home justified before God. It's the tax collector who comes before God with a humble heart filled with trust in God's grace and God's love. And Jesus says, follow his example when coming before God. The correct way we respond to God's love and grace is by loving our neighbor. And we don't get to pick which person is worthy of our love. We don't get to pick which people are welcome. And we certainly do not get to sit in judgment of other people. We don't get to pick because God doesn't pick and choose who's deserving of grace and love. God invites all people. God welcomes all people. God loves all people. That includes the self-righteous Pharisee. That includes that most despised tax collector. That includes you and me. So today Jesus invites us to consider who the people are that we think we're better than. Who the people are that we're more righteous than. Who the people are that don't belong, in our opinion. We're invited to think about who those folks are that we would use as material for our own humble brag. The people we would use as fodder to make them smaller so we could feel bigger. Because Jesus reminds us that those people are children of God, just like us. And just like us, we are all in need of the same grace. We are called to be humble. And we are called to love all people as extravagantly as God has loved all of us. Amen.